Well, today we're beginning a new teaching series. We're entitling it Fearless. For those of you who've been here for the past 6 weeks, I'm not sure if you're feeling like I am, but I'm feeling like I need a rest from Sabbath. That was don't give me those shakings of heads. It was tough to figure out what it is that God has been saying to us. For those of you who are guests, I apologize, you wouldn't have got that. We spent 6 weeks just talking about God's admonition to us, his gentle reminder that we are to slow down and that we are to rest. And this morning we begin our new teaching series, Fearless, so I'm not too anxious about it, but I know that for many of us, we deal with fears. In fact, all of us do. And so it's a timeful message for you and for me. We've all experienced fear at one time or another. Maybe when we were children, some of that has traumatized us enough that it's carried into our adulthood. Fear is no respecter of persons. Phobia, which is extreme fear, is defined as getting terribly scared of particular objects, people, or situations without, at least at times, any sensible explanation. We are just afraid. Phobias are disturbing. They occur often when we least expect it, and it just hits us, and it's palpable, like we know when we are afraid. Well, in preparation for this morning and for this series, we did our own intense scientific research to find out what, in fact, people are afraid of. And, in fact, some of you, so watch this.
Spiders.
Probably embarrassment.
I actually is afraid to answer questions in front of a camera.
I fear spiders and snakes. Fear itself.
I am scared of war because it's so bad and it can cause so much destruction in the world.
I'm afraid of losing my family. That's pretty much it.
I'm afraid of not going to heaven when I grow up.
Not being liked by a lot of people. And spiders.
Death. Everyone's afraid of death, right?
Snakes. Spiders and insects and all of those things.
I fear dogs.
Intimacy.
Children.
I'm not sure who should be more afraid, Steve and Gloria or their child, but they did have their little baby girl this past week, and so at some point, we can give them a hand. At some point when they're ready, they'll come out of their hibernation and we'll get to meet the family. Well, phobias. We're all afraid of something. Most of the common ones you just heard on that video. Mysophobia, which is the fear of germs. Claustrophobia, of course, the fear of being in a small, tight space. Astrophobia, fear of thunder and lightning. Cynophobia, the fear of dogs. We heard that one. Agoraphobia, the fear of open or crowded spaces. Acrophobia, fear of heights. That's one that gets me most of the time. Ophidiophobia, which is the fear of snakes. And then arachnophobia, which is the fear of spiders. So we know some of those things, and for some of us, we actually deal with that fear. It's real. Now, there's a few, though, that are almost stranger than fiction. Let me just share a couple of those with you. There's orophobia, which is the fear of finding gold, or chromatopia, which is a fear of money. I would like to be friends with those people who have those fears because I could help them with what they are afraid of. But then there's nomophobia. For some of you, you didn't realize what it was, but this is what you have, the fear of being without a cell phone. There's venistrophobia. That's the fear of beautiful women. We're not going to spend any time on that one either. There's euphobia, the fear of good news. Wow. Then there's phobophobia. That's probably my favorite, the fear of phobias, the fear of being afraid. I mean, and we can laugh at some of these, but for some, they are very, very real. In fact, if she was out here, one of our musicians asked me if I knew the phobia of long words. And she was a psych major, and so she actually could say it. And it's like a really long word in and of itself, which talks about the fear of long words. But there are phobias out there. We are fearful people by nature. This morning, while the topic is fearless, we're going to be going in a slightly different direction. We're not going to just say, well, we're afraid of this, and so how do we deal with it? We are going to talk about fear over the next 4 weeks. We're going to talk about what it means to live fearless, not totally without fear. I don't think in our fallen world that's possible. There are, in fact, some things that we should fear. So we don't want to be totally fearless. But the focus is going to be on dealing with the worry and the fear and the anxiety that many of us live with from one perspective or another. I trust that what we're going to discover during this teaching series is that following Jesus, saying yes to Jesus, while it will always involve a certain level of fear. So just because we're a follower of Jesus doesn't mean that there's not going to be these moments of fear in our lives. But following him, whatever direction he might take us, however he might lead us, we grow in him. We grow in the likeness of Jesus. We begin to understand more and more about who Jesus is. And at the end of the day, it's all about Jesus and how he is the one who comes into our lives and helps us deal with our fears and with our anxieties. What we're going to try to move from is fear to faith. It's a journey. It's one that will take us the rest of our lives. We will never quite get there, but we can make progress. And I trust that this teaching series is going to enable us to do that. So this morning I want to take you on a walk with Jesus. We're going to walk kind of where he walked, and we're going to look at a story that the gospel writer John tells us in John chapter 11. So we're going to follow this quite closely this morning. So if you have your Bibles, turn them on. John chapter 11, beginning at verse 1. If you're using the Bibles that are on the chairs or in front of you this morning, it's page 871, John chapter 11. And we know this story as the raising of Lazarus. Now, while this story deals with the death of Lazarus, it deals with the resurrection of Lazarus, likely the most remarkable miracle out of all the ones that he performed. It tells us more about Jesus than Lazarus. It tells us more about his power. And in fact, it's a foreshadowing, of course, of his own death and his own resurrection. So the story could be generally dealing with our fear of death, because that's real. For many of us, we may not be afraid of dying, but maybe the process of dying. But death brings a whole bunch of elements of fear. And that is part of the story, but it's not going to be our focus this morning. Because our focus, again, is going to be on the one who calms our fears, including the fear of death. So we're going to look at this story and see what it has to teach us. First and foremost about Jesus, but then also about us individually and our fear. So John chapter 11, let me just set the context briefly for you. The story takes place in the little village of Bethany. Jesus himself is about a day's travel east of there, yet he's on the other side of the Jordan River. He had just spent some time in Jerusalem talking to them about his being the good shepherd. He had healed a blind man, and the people, the religious leaders of the day, were getting very angry with him. They were plotting on how to kill him, how to stone him, and so they did have to leave. So they're about a day away, further east yet. Bethany itself is a small town east of Jerusalem, less than 2 miles away. Bethany was a place that served kind of as the base for Jesus. When he was in the Jerusalem area, that's kind of where he called home this little town of Bethany. We're also told that this was home, Bethany, to 3 of Jesus' closest, dearest friends, Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. So that's kind of the background to where we are. John chapter 11, verse 1. Follow along with me. A man named Lazarus was sick. He lived in Bethany with his sisters, Mary and Martha. This is the Mary who later poured the expensive perfume on the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was sick. So the two sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, Lord, your dear friend is very sick. We'll just pause there for a moment. Your dear friend is sick. Didn't have to say who he was. Jesus would have known. The messenger would have come. We just said, your dear friend. He would have known immediately that they were talking about Lazarus. Another translation puts it, the one you love. So just very endearing, exactly who they were talking about. And Jesus has this interesting response. Verse 4. When Jesus heard about this, so the messenger has come. Martha and Mary, they sent a messenger to Jesus. They knew where he was. That's interesting. Even though he was somewhat in hiding, they knew how to get in touch with him. Probably took about a day for the messenger to get to Jesus. And then Jesus heard it and he said this, Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No. It happened for the glory of God so that the Son of God would receive glory from this. So just pause there again for a moment. Jesus had just come. If you go back in John chapter 9, John chapter 10, John chapter 9, Jesus had just healed this blind man who had been born blind. And of course, in that day, the question always was, well, then who sinned? If he was born blind, then either he sinned or his parents sinned. Who was it? And Jesus said, nobody sinned. He was born blind. But out of that, you're going to see the glory of God. Well, it's almost exactly the same phrase here when he's talking now about Lazarus. He says, he's not end in death. It happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this. So, verse 5, although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, so he repeats it again, like these are close friends of his. He stayed where he was for the next 2 days. Just pause there for a moment. Now, at first reading, that does seem a little odd. No matter what it is that Jesus is going to do, this is one of his closest friends. Mary and Martha are his closest friends. They're saying, now, it's interesting what they didn't say. They didn't say to Jesus, come. It's kind of implied, like Jesus, and they knew Jesus. They'd seen him do miracles, so they knew he could heal someone who was sick. So they were just basically throwing it out there for Jesus, like, hey, he's really sick, and you really love him. If he's really sick and you really love him, what are you going to do? You're going to come racing back and save the day. And Jesus' response, nope, we're going to wait a couple of days. Understand, God's timing is generally not our timing. There are things that God knows. There are times that we are praying, we are looking to God. There's something that we're dealing with. There's a fear that is upon us, and we're asking God for help, and it seems at times like there is no answer. Well, just understand that God knows, and God's timing is always perfect, but sometimes it's not ours. Understand, too, in this story that Jesus not coming quickly was not the cause of Lazarus' death. If you read this story and know that Jesus is approximately a day away, and it would have taken then a messenger to get to Jesus about a day, and then Jesus waited 2 extra days before he left, then he came. So there was about 4 days in between Jesus, before they started this message system and when Jesus got there. 4 days. Later you're going to hear that Lazarus had already been dead for 4 days. So Jesus, he didn't cause the death. But he was going to use the death to teach his disciples, to teach Martha and Mary, to teach the people around, and hopefully to teach you and me. Verse 7, so finally he said to his disciples, let's go to Judea. Well, immediately his disciples were objecting. Rabbi, only a few days ago the people in Judea were trying to stone you. Are you going there again? So I told you that story, chapters 9 and 10. He was in the Jerusalem area, and they were ready to kill him. I mean, we're getting close now to the end of Jesus' life. And so even this story of Lazarus' death and resurrection is very much in line with what's coming, and Jesus is kind of foreshadowing that as we're going through this story. Jesus replied, well, there's 12 hours of daylight every day. During the day, people can walk safely. They can see because they have the light of this world. But at the night, there's danger of stumbling. They have no light. And then he said, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but now I'm going to go and wake him up. I mean, he had just talked in chapter 9 when he healed the blind man. He gave one of his famous I am sayings. And in that context of healing a man who could not see, he said, I am the light of the world. Jesus is always teaching. He's always trying to help those who are closest to him understand more and more about who he is and why he came. But then John is also fun to read because he throws in some of the irony and some of the humor that's taking place behind the scenes. And they probably don't get the humor right away. They probably got it afterwards. But, Jesus was saying, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. I want to go wake him. And then the disciples said what? Well, if he's just sleeping, then he's going to get better. And then he's going to wake up. Isn't that cool? So why are we worried? So John just puts in, this is the normal things that happen in a normal relationship. Sometimes there's miscommunication. Sometimes we don't fully understand. And so Jesus said, okay, well then, I just have to tell you, he's dead. Okay, so let's get, okay, he's dead. He's gone. He's over with. And then he says these words, for your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there. Because now you will what? Really believe. That's going to be key coming up. So now he says, after 2 days of finding out this news, he says, let's go, and we're going to go and see him. And then it's funny. Again, Thomas, nicknamed the twin. This is the doubting Thomas. This is the Thomas who, I'm not really sure why John threw that in here, other than maybe he was being sarcastic about Thomas, because he probably knew that Thomas was really not interested in going to Jerusalem and dying. But he just thought, well, maybe that's the right thing to say. But John just throws that in. Let's go too. We can just die with Jesus. We'll all have a dying party together. Seriously, this is not what this is about. But you just see real people interacting with Jesus, just like you and I. We ask some of these silly things, but Jesus loves us anyway, and he just keeps going with us. So then we read these words in verse 17. When Jesus arrived at Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in his grave for 4 days. We'll just pause there for a moment because it's very significant that John writes that Lazarus has been in the grave for 4 days. It was Jewish tradition of that day that said the soul kind of hung around the dead body for about 3 days. And if the body didn't show any signs of life, the soul was gone. Jewish tradition would say that people would go to the grave for the first 3 days just to see if maybe he was resuscitated. Maybe this person that we thought had died really hadn't died. But after 3 days, they were dead. And I think John is being really clear here when he wants us to know that he's been in that grave 4 days. Because again, in the Jewish tradition, the day, as soon as you die, you get buried. Put some spices on you, you're there for about a year, and then they come back and they do some other things. But 4 days, he's dead. I think John wants us to know that Lazarus was dead. This wasn't Jesus coming into the story and then being able to say, oh, well, maybe he really hadn't died. No, that's not true. Lazarus had died. Let's continue the story. Bethany was only a few miles down the road from Jerusalem. John throws that in. Here's another little tidbit. I think John's just letting us know they're really close to Jerusalem. Jesus was a well-known figure. There were already people who had run back to Jerusalem to tell the high, the high priests and the religious leaders, Jesus is back. We should be planning on how we can go and get him and kill him. We're told many of the people in verse 19 had come to console Martha and Mary in their loss. Death in that day was a very communal affair. It was a very loud affair. Everybody was there. In fact, we read here that many people came from Jerusalem. I mean, a 2-mile walk is still a fairly good walk. They had come to grieve with them. And then they grieved loudly, and they were wailing. So they had come to console Martha and Mary. Verse 20, when Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him. But Mary stayed in the house. And just look at these words in verse 21. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask. Just pause there for a moment. Can you see what she's struggling with? What you and I struggle with? She loved Jesus. She had spent these years with Jesus. She had seen him heal people from deadly disease. She had seen him do that. He spent time in her house. They would have sat together. They would have talked together. They would have eaten together. She knew Jesus, and she knew that Jesus could have healed her brother. So she said, she's trying to be kind. Isn't it, like all at the same time? She says, if you had been here, he wouldn't have died. Like, I know that. But you didn't come. Like, and I don't know why, but I still love you. And even now I know that God's going to give you whatever you ask. Like she really, she was just torn. I mean, can you identify? Like, you know Jesus and you love Jesus. But stuff happens and it's just like, where is he? Like, I've called on him and I'm not giving up on him, but it's just hard. I mean, I just love how John lets us know that these are real people dealing with real issues, just like you and I. Well, it's that comment. Well, then Jesus responds in verse 23, your brother will rise again. And Martha says, I know, like in the end days, he'll rise again. Like they had this belief in the afterlife, in eternal life. And so they were ready for that. And then Jesus gives probably the most significant I am statement, the most significant claim about himself that he gave while he was on earth. Because he does not say, I can provide life. It's implied, but literally Jesus says, and look at these words now. We're in verse 25. Jesus says, I am. Just pause there. I am. Sound familiar? If any of you have read through your Old Testament, Moses standing at the burning bush, who is it that's speaking to me? I am. Jehovah God, Yahweh, I am. Jesus unequivocally stating who he is. He's God. I am the resurrection. I don't just give it. I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never die. And then the question, do you believe this, Martha? Just pause here for a moment because this is the heart of the passage. It's here that the gospel writer John continues to show us Jesus is not simply some nice guy wandering around the Middle East doing some cool things, having some neat teachings, but that's it. John is saying to you and to me, as he was to the people of his day when they would have read this later, this gospel, Jesus has entered into human history. God himself has acted visibly, concretely in human history. Jesus is not just the light. He gives sight to those who cannot see, who are in darkness. He is not just the resurrection and the life. He brings life back to a man who was in the tomb. But you understand, do you not, that the story of Lazarus is really not about Lazarus. It's about Jesus. We can place our confidence in him, in the power, in the person of Jesus Christ. He is the one who calms all of our fears, all of our anxiety. See, Jesus is telling us that while eternal life is a gift from God, that the finality of death is in fact not real, that there is life after death, that is a gift that God gives to us. We can understand that. But it is more than something that is just in the future. It is something that you and I can recognize and appropriate today. Gary Berge puts it this way in his commentary. He says, they are aspects, those gifts, of what it means to live a life in association with Jesus now, today. Because if Jesus is life, like he said he is, then those of us who believe in him, who say yes to the question, do you believe this? We'll enjoy that confidence and that power today over death, over whatever it is that we are dealing with, whatever fear that we might have. That's the life that's available to you and to me today, not sometime in the future. Victory is ours today over our fear of death, over our fear of conflict, over whatever it is that we fear, whatever it is that has control over us. That's why we sang that this morning. Death has been arrested. If Jesus has victory over death, he has victory over anything, everything that we fear. But at the end, Jesus asks Martha this question. It's the title of our message. Do you believe this? What a question. Do you believe this, Martha? And really, I would suggest that the answer to that is probably beyond her comprehension. She doesn't fully grasp it. Not yet. She does believe in Jesus. I mean, she really wants to believe. I mean, verse 27, yes, Lord, I've always believed you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who's come into the world from God. I mean, she wants to believe this. She puts that as best as she knows how. But before we get too comfortable or judgmental of her, know that Jesus is asking you and I that very question this morning. Do you believe this? Do you believe this? See, understand, Jesus isn't making some generic claim about life after death. Religious leaders were making that claim for thousands of years, literally. He's doing something much more profound. He's saying, if you believe in me, not a God somewhere, if you believe in me, and that's a remarkable statement. Easy for us to gloss over, especially if we've read the Bible before. We dare not gloss over this. Jesus says, anyone who believes in me will live, even after dying. So he asks us the question, do you believe this? Do you believe in me? And I understand there's a lot of mystery involved in that question. There's a lot of unknown. We don't know everything about life after death. We know some things, but it's easy to have some doubt, easy to have some fear. You know, Martha said, I believe you are the Son of God. But later in the story, we'll find out when push came to shove and she saw Lazarus where he was buried for 4 days, she just wasn't sure what the Son of God could actually do. She had doubts. She had fear. You know, join the world of human beings. Well, if you're here this morning, you have doubts about this man, Jesus, it's okay. Know that here, Encounter Church is a safe place to explore who Jesus is. But I would challenge you to make a sincere commitment to search out the answer. Do your research. Find out if, in fact, Jesus is who he claims to be, because there's an eternity riding on that question. Yours. And this man, Jesus, he stands unparalleled in the history of the world, literally. He's the one who's asking you the question. Do you believe in me? Okay, let's go back to our story. We got to wrap this up. Verse 28. Then Martha returned to Mary. She called Mary aside from the mourners and told her, the teacher is here and wants to see you. And so Mary immediately went to him. We're told that Jesus had stayed outside the village at the place where Martha met him. When the people who were at the house consoling Mary saw her leave so hastily, they assumed she was going to Lazarus' grave to weep, so they followed her there. And when Mary arrived and saw Jesus, she fell at his feet. And look at the question she asks. Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. Understand, Jesus knew and knows. His ministry wasn't just to Lazarus. It was to Martha and to Mary and to you and to me. So I find it fascinating. He does not rebuke their grief. Ever. Martha and Mary were crying. He doesn't say, well, suck it up. In a moment, I'm going to raise him from the dead. It's all going to be fine. No, he doesn't do that. He didn't tell them it was a waste of time. I mean, even when he knew what he was going to do, he understood their grief. He understands our grief. And know that he gives us permission to grieve, permission to doubt, permission to question, permission to figure this stuff out, because it's not easy. He gave them permission. He gives us permission to say, death is terrible. Death is horrible. Death is painful. I fear it. Saying those things in no way diminishes your faith in Jesus. It just acknowledges what's real. And Jesus understood that for Martha and Mary. And so he was there to comfort them. But he also was there to gently teach them. He was also there to gently move them forward. Because he wanted them to know and us to know that death and sin and fear, those are all foes that Jesus Christ has defeated. So look at verse 33. And Jesus saw her weeping, saw the other people wailing with her. So he understood what was going on. But then look what it says. A deep anger welled up within him, and he was deeply troubled. Just pause there for a moment. That word, and it's done pretty well in our New Living Translation, a deep anger, that's very much what it was. It's even stronger than that. It's like an outburst of outrage. That Jesus finally, it's almost like he's had enough of the results of sin and the results of a fallen world. It's like there was this outburst of fury and outrage and anger, and they could just see it on his face. And probably he could just barely get out these words, but he's like, where have you put him? Take me to him. So they said, Lord, come and see. And we're told that Jesus wept. And I think there are times that we think, oh, as they did, it says, oh, see how they loved him, how he loved Lazarus. No. I mean, Jesus did know what he was going to do. He didn't have to weep for Lazarus. He didn't have to put on a show for the people. Oh, it's okay to cry. That's not what he was doing. He was so angry at death, so outraged at sin, that he wept. The same words, the same tears that when he stood over the city of Jerusalem and just wished that they had believed in him, and they did not, and we're told that he wept. But he goes on. And I find it interesting that some people said, see how much he loved him, and then others said, well, why didn't he come sooner and fix it? Why didn't he come sooner and heal him? He could do that if he's God, if he's Jesus, if he says who he claims to be. I mean, isn't that interesting that there's all those kinds of people were there at the graveside? Those who loved him and those who still were plotting to kill him. They were seeing what he was doing, and yet they still couldn't believe. I think that's why Jesus continues to ask us the question, do you believe this? I mean, do you really believe this? Jesus was still angry, we're told, as he arrived at the tomb. Cave with a stone rolled across its entrance. Roll the stone aside. Now here, Martha comes in. We're told that, it's interesting, John says this is the dead man's sister. Okay, well, we know that, but he's interesting. He's got good detail here. And so she's the one who said, yes, I believe you are the Son of God. Yes, I believe that. I wish you had been here to heal him when he was sick, but yes, I believe. And then now, when she's confronted with the fact that the stone's going to be rolled away, and her brother, who's been dead for 4 days and stinks because of decomposition, she says, we can't roll that stone away. Isn't it good that John just puts that in there for all of us? Like, no matter how much we love and believe, there are times that it's just hard. It's just hard. And Jesus' response, didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe? And so they rolled the stone aside, and Jesus looked up to heaven, and he prayed. Implying that he's already prayed privately. He's already talked to God. He already knows what's going to happen. He's already going to call down all of this power. It's going to be there when he needs it. But then he says, but they have to hear this too. And so he says, I'm going to say this out loud. But he uses the word Father, not our Father. In this case, it's very personal. It's very intimate. He's talking to Father. And he is saying to them, Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me. I said it out loud for the sake of these people, so that they will believe that you sent me. And then we read these famous words, Lazarus, come out. And again, we don't do justice with our English that just says come out. It was raw authority that made the proclamation, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, hands and feet bound in grave clothes, face unwrapped in a headcloth. Jesus told them, unwrap him and let him go. Understand, just put a little context now into that very last part. Jewish law demanded that you couldn't come into contact with a dead person. You had to be like, I don't know how far away. You could not go close to a dead person. So Jesus says, come out. Lazarus walks out. He's all still in his spices and cloths. What do you think Jesus did? Can you picture it? We're not told this. This is my conjecture. What do you think Jesus did? He ran to Lazarus. He hugged him. He says, hey, man, how you doing? Wasn't this cool? Dead, now alive? Wow. They probably had a conversation. This is his dearest friend. The joy on Jesus' face, he must have been laughing. He conquered death. He can do that for you and me. Whatever it is that we fear, whatever it is that we're going through. The man who could raise Lazarus from the dead, who could raise himself from the grave, is the one who says, I will be with you and I will comfort you. And I wonder what Mary and Martha did. I mean, they were good Jewish ladies. Like, did they leave that protocol behind? Did they rush up to their brother? It's interesting, isn't it? I have fun thinking about that kind of stuff. Okay, one more time. We do have to end. The Apostle John tells us throughout the story, it is all about Jesus. It has everything to do with our understanding and our confidence in the power of Jesus. Is he who he claims to be? He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Now, that's a truth that Martha and Mary did not know yet. The people around that gravesite did not know that truth yet. We have the privilege of being after the fact of Jesus' death and his resurrection, so they didn't know that truth yet. We have that truth today, and we understand that the power that raised Lazarus and the power that raised Jesus is available to you and to me each and every day. So back to our question. Do you believe this? Do you believe it? The Apostle Paul puts it this way in Colossians 1, Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. Do you believe this? If you don't, what I can tell you is that you will live a life of fear and a life of anxiety. But it's not who we're going to choose to be. That's my challenge. We're going to go on a journey as individuals and as a church. A journey that God has put before us, his purposes for you and for me, and it does not involve fear.